Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for our last and final ISC webinar for this year, or knowledge sharing webinar for this year. We're excited to have today with us Mr. Francois Dubrou, who is the CEO and co-founder of Cosmosis Private Limited, to share with all of you a little bit about financing for space. So for a lot of you guys, you have been asking questions about how can you find out more about how to do the financial report when it comes to planning for your project. This is the time for you to ask all the questions, or at least have some understanding of what goes behind any space business in the industry. So, you know, if you want to be the next Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or whatever, this is the webinar for you to find out all about that. So yeah, we're excited to have all of you joining us for the final webinar of ISC 2022. We hope the journey has been a memorable one for all of you, and through it all, you've taken away a little bit of knowledge, or a lot, hopefully. But yeah, I won't dwell too much on this. We still have a lot to cover for the last month of ISC, but in the meantime, I'll hand it over to Francois to start his presentation. Francois, whenever you're ready, you can feel free to unmute and turn on your camera.
Okay. Hello.
We can hear you, Francois.
Démarrer, switch on the video. Okay. Okay, good evening or good morning, everybody. I'm very proud to speak to you today. I will give you a little bit of background, just to briefly introduce myself to you. I've been in the aerospace industry for 30 years, and I've been through, I would say, almost any kind of position you may have, in that industry. I started as a system engineer at a company at that time was called Matra Marconi Space. Now it's Airbus Defence and Space in Toulouse. And I started with working on a famous program like SOHO and the Very Large Telescope on the adaptive optics. And also I went to the Earth Observation Program. So the French program Spot Helios. And I ended at Airbus with the geostationary satellite, a few of them, for telecommunication at that time. And after that, I moved to the world of finance, and where I did some investment and also insurance, of course, still for space. So I was insuring rocket launches, in-orbit life for spacecraft, satellites, and I moved as a risk manager of Alcatel. I can also explain later, if you wish, what a risk manager does. And then I left this big corporation to be an entrepreneur, where I developed a few companies. Some of them failed, some of them succeed, and still addressing the space or the aerospace business. But again, I think I have gathered, quite of an experience, of this in this field, and I'm very, very happy to share a bit of experience, with you. So I suggest, we go through this presentation, and after that, you can ask any question you want about what you want to know about the space financing business in general. I'm happy to help you. Yes, so I'm sure, you guess, who's that character on the screen. Maybe either anybody who doesn't know who this guy is, okay? And as far as I heard, he said, I am the best in space financing, okay? But you can have some doubt, because this is William Shakespeare. And in fact, I will explain you what's the connection between Shakespeare and in fact financing. Maybe you can go to the other slide, please. Okay. In fact, you have to understand that financing is an art, and financing, it's like writing like Shakespeare. Okay. So that requires, a lot of skills, different skill you build over the years, and to reach, this art of financing that gives you all the tools to express what you are trying to achieve with your project. So in other words, trying to get some resources at the best price and deploy these resources the best way. This is a way, we can define, the financing of a project or finance in general. And this is the same definition, of course, for other industry. I can, of course, go into more detail, if you wish. So before, of course, writing like Shakespeare, you have to understand, the alphabet first. So the alphabet, presented on this slide, is not really this one, you need to know, because everybody knows this alphabet for sure. But it's another alphabet, So can you move to the next slide? Yeah. So this is this kind of alphabet. What I mean by that, it's totally pointless to try to remember everything, or to try to unravel, the mystery of these graphs. But what I mean by that is that the alphabet, in fact, is your project itself. The project itself is the breakdown of the project in little pieces. So each action you take, each piece or component part, you purchase, each move you make, in hiring someone, is part of the alphabet. So you need to know first exactly how does your project look like, okay? And of course, if it's your first time you're making a space project, or again, same thing for any kind of project, you have to get some, or to try to get some help, from people who are a little bit experienced, and that will help you to, same thing, to break down, all these steps you have all along your project. So once you can break down this project, you can go after that, to the what we can call the budgeting. So in fact, we will transform these little pieces into numbers, and not only the numbers, but also some provision in the background, okay, that applies to the numbers. You can go to the next slide, please. So, and once you have decomposed this element from your project, you can start to assemble words. So I just get some fun, and creating this cloud of words, and there's a lot of words, that comes. I would say mostly there's a cost, the price, the currency, what else? The risk, transportation, Incoterms, design, and so on and so forth, delivery as well. Of course, there's a word strategy. So people who like, abstract or very complicated things, they like talking about strategy. So strategy, how to go somewhere, and what are the conditions to go to somewhere. But we will stick, to something extremely pragmatic. But strategy is also an important part, to go to budgeting, because it will raise certain questions I can describe to you a little bit later. So you can go to the next slide, please. So when we try to put the words, in order, we can try to go from one point to another. I will be quick on that because it's also related to everybody's experience you can build in making your project, but your project must consider the very basic for space is, of course, the design at start. So you must at least, on a piece of paper, try to make some drawings and say, oh, I have this idea. So I have to make a little drawings and try to imagine, whether it works or not. So you can do that on the computer, or when I mention, an analogic machine, it could be a prototype. So you can make, I don't know, an aircraft with a piece of paper, and you can try to play with it. Okay. So that's the first part of it. And of course, you have to understand what kind of resource you need to make I would say, acceptable design. Okay. So that means that you need to address your concern to people who knows how to design it. And these people, they will ask you some money in return. Of course, it will take time. And you will have, of course, before starting the design, try to guess, whether it's feasible or not, and how much time does it take. And because also time is money, you have, of course, to use your savings maybe, or to try to find some money around to, of course, to pay for all the effort you will put at start, when you start, the project. When your design is mature enough, you can try to, and you can start, building it. Okay. So this paragraph, I put some details about it, just to show you that it's not simply, oh, I buy something, it's easy. It's in fact a very complex topic, procuring a component or even procuring system. This is something very complex because there's no best answer. We can formulate some answer that will depend on the condition you are, in your project. Procurement strategy, I started with that. Give you an example, for our project Cosmosis, we have adopted the strategy from start, is to make this project the most Singaporean project possible. I'm not Singaporean, I'm a French citizen, but I'm trying, of course, to use resources, local resource, to design the spacecraft and to make this spacecraft real. So, of course, when you decide on a strategy, it must be like a magnet, in other words. You have to try to do your best for that. But of course, the same thing, we could adopt a totally different strategy for that. We can decide to make this, I don't know, this spacecraft in Europe, for instance, because for any kind of reason, because you're European. And once you have decided that, of course, your strategy can change. Okay, and it's not a problem, to change your strategy even along the way, because it's always very, very difficult to guess what's ahead. And sometimes you can be surprised by events. So in facing this kind of situation, you can change your strategy and say, okay, maybe what I was trying to do was too difficult. I just prefer, taking an easier pathway. After that, of course, when you, in terms of pure procurement, when you have to procure a component or a sub-assembly or part or whatever, you try to, of course, to find on the market, where is the most fitted component for your design. You can try to buy, I don't know, a microchip. It could be a valve. It could be a solar panel. And for that, we just a little bit of advice. Sometimes the academics, they like, let's say, doing by the books. They say, oh, competition is great because competition will give you the best price. Competition will give you probably the best product, depending on the quality you're looking for. And competition is healthy because it pushes people to do their best. Okay, it's not always true. It's not always true. This is something you will learn over this very project with SSTL, or maybe in your future career. Sometimes, for certain reason, which also belong to your strategy, is way much better not to seek for looking for the best price. Okay, but sometimes you accept to pay just a premium, and that's very rational, because in paying a premium to one supplier, you get it loyal over the years. Okay, and you understand him better when he say, oh, I cannot make what you are looking for. And you can create a certain complicity that, okay, makes your project eventually more efficient. So yes, for sure, competition, it's an interesting tool, but it's not, as we say, the alpha and the omega, of the project. After that, when you face, of course, the procurement of a part, or again, components, subassembly, whatever, when you procure something, there's a lot of vocabulary, behind that. So you have this ROM cost or ROM price, so rough order of magnitude. So you ask the guy and you say, okay, can you, I don't know, sell me your antenna, okay? And the guy said, actually, I don't know, could be 100, could be 200. This is my ROM price, 150, but I'm not sure, could change. So it could be a bit malicious, okay? But sometimes it could be real, because the guy, just started to develop a component, and at the time you're talking to him, he doesn't know exactly what would be its own production cost. So it's very hard sometimes when you're very, very early on new technologies to have a complete or a very clear picture on the total cost of a product. So by consequence, the price, your supplier, will accept to sell you the component. After that, you can ask your supplier, what's your ceiling price? So it's a price which will be the maximum, okay? But it's pretty dangerous, because if you ask for a ceiling price, and to a certain extent, you accept his ceiling price, he has absolutely no reason, to deflate, his price afterwards. So maybe you can be stuck, with that. Sometimes, the good aspect of it is that you ask for a firm fixed price. Okay, firm fixed price means that price is not supposed to change. As it's not supposed to change at that time, but is not supposed to change, in a few years or in a few coming years. So that means that this price, you can sleep with that. Probably the guy, is making a lot of margin, but if you like the guy, he can make some margin. It's not a problem. The exchange, is that you're satisfied with this product. But sometimes you have some condition where the price is subject to be escalated. Okay, we've been living a period, maybe until today, it can change tomorrow, but a period where inflation, is not something very common in the developed countries. But again, by the way, inflation can come back. But something like 15, 20 years ago, prices, could be subject to inflation, because there were some commodities, that was, which cost was going higher. So you had to revise the price maybe once a year, and saying, oh, if you buy, this antenna in 2021, you'll pay 100. And if you buy this antenna in 2022, you'll pay 110. With that, delivery schedules. Okay, of course, you make sure that your supplier propose a delivery schedule for his product, exactly matching with the moment you need its product. Okay. And for that, you must build, some fair agreement. You must make sure that if the guy is very late, he must pay penalties. Okay, so he's subject to have a sort of a financial punishment, where he said, okay, I cannot deliver you on January 1st, okay, because I'm going to a big party. I can only deliver you my product on January 2nd. And you say, sorry, my friend, you have to pay a penalty, okay? Could be a few dollars, could be much more sometimes. Okay. Also, of course, the currency issue is something that you have not to forget, because there could be some big fluctuation between the currency. So make sure that everybody has a good understanding on the currencies you're playing with. Usually it's US dollars, still today. Maybe it can change tomorrow. Could be, why not, the renminbi, we don't know, but we are not there yet. And after that, it can be a bit technical. So we talk about Incoterms. Incoterms is that what are the conditions attached to the delivery. The guy can say, okay, I can deliver my product, at your door. It's like, the Deliveroo you have in Singapore when you want to order a meal or something. You have a guy, just knocking at your door, and you open the door and he gives you, your meal. And by the way, it's called, it's the DDP, Incoterm, so delivery duty paid. And so this is one form of delivery. I will explain you why it's important. Another example of Incoterm could be X work. X work is the guy said, I manufacture this product in my facility, and I put the parcel at my door of my facility, and you are in charge of picking it up. Okay, and that makes a world of difference. And I just giving you a clarification about that, because in fact it concerns your whole project. Who takes the risk between you, your customer, your suppliers? And at the end of the day, it can change dramatically the risk you take. It can change by consequence, the total cost of your project. What I mean by that is that with this example of X work, so you have to go. Sometimes it could be by walk if it's in Singapore, but maybe sometimes you purchase a product in the US, for instance. So of course you don't go to the US for that. You ask some companies to do the job. Could be FedEx, UPS, and a few others. And this guy, they will, of course, take the parcel at the door of the facility. They will have to carry the parcel in a truck. Then after that, it will fly, to Singapore. It will have to go to through the customs. It will have to pay the taxes, so the GST, when it enters the Singapore territory. And this is the same regime in every country in the world, with, of course, some slight difference. But that means that taking the risk and taking the responsibility brings into the game some difference in terms of budget, because in DDP you don't pay for the transport, but don't forget that the transport is included in the cost of your supplier. So for X work, so you will pay for the transport, and also you will have some risk, because the truck can, I don't know, have an accident. Poor guy, but the truck has an accident and your parcel is destroyed. So what do you do in such case? You have sometimes to use the insurance, but it's also a point you have to discuss with your supplier. Okay. And make sure that, if your product is destroyed, you have to find a backup. Oops, what happened? Oh, it's my accident. Okay, thank you. So the risk management, in fact, is something global in your project. It concerns the planning, it concerns the cost, and it concerns everything which is connected to also the payment conditions, okay, the installment and so on and so forth. So this is for the procurement. And once you have received all of your parts, all of your components, you start to assemble, integrate, and test all the parts that makes your project or your spacecraft a beautiful object. Okay. And for that, you're not obliged, to do the work yourself. Okay, you can try to find companies which are specialized for that. Okay, and these are the big names, could be Boeing, it could be Thales Alenia Space, Airbus Defence and Space, Maxar, it could be who else? Lockheed Martin, maybe I mentioned them already. But if you're in Singapore, you can see some very good company like New Space, yeah, and I'm pretty proud, to work with New Space here in Singapore, and they do a pretty good job, and of course, you have to discuss, what are the conditions to do the job, because you will have to ask them a quote, and they would say, to assemble the spacecraft, this will cost this, to integrate your spacecraft and the testing, and of course, to develop and submit, this quote, it will ask from you some documentation, because they will ask you, how do you want me to integrate your spacecraft, or what kind of test do you want to do? Okay, you cannot address, your concern, like, again, something, any product you want to procure, like this, I want an antenna, but what kind of antenna? You have to very precisely define, your specification. And you understand why we are back, to this alphabet you never have to forget, is that, yes, you have to know exactly how your product, is made, so you can elaborate, on that, and you say, this product of this size must be vibrated, that way, or must be exposed in thermal vacuum, in a certain condition, in a certain position, just to try to restitute exactly what you want and what you expect your spacecraft to behave once it's in orbit. After that, the launch and the launch cost, of course, this is really the headache part, okay? Because of course, this is the most expensive part, okay, of a launch. I can illustrate it to you with some political aspect we always have to take into account, which is also an important feature in a project, is that depending on where you are in the world and what kind of component you put on board your spacecraft, you could be banned, to launch with certain launchers. Okay. For instance, if on your spacecraft you have some American component, okay, you will be probably banned to launch with a Chinese launcher. Okay. So these are some aspect of a project you have to think, very early in advance. And this is also part of your strategy, okay? The way you want to bring, your spacecraft in orbit. Sometimes you have to decide of a certain policy. There were, for instance, when I was a long time ago in Alcatel Space, there were a policy to avoid or to stay neutral in the game. Alcatel Space has adopted an ITAR-free satellite. ITAR is the regulation from the US to control the export of component, okay, for certain reason. And an ITAR-free component, an ITAR-free satellite, is a satellite which has 0 component from the US. So you have to find some substitute component, and sometimes it's not very easy, okay, because sometimes there are some, I would say, monopolistic position, and yeah, sometimes it's only in the US, so there's some additional work to do. So this is something global, to think before, of course, launching. And as I mentioned, the launch cost is probably the highest part of a budget, even when you launch a CubeSat, okay? Launching a CubeSat, can cost, yeah, between, let's say, 100,000, maybe a little bit less, sometimes, but it could be much more, okay? But when you launch a big geostationary telecommunication satellite, yeah, the launch cost, could be more than 100 million. And when you think about the price NASA has paid to launch the James Webb Telescope on board Ariane 5, that's a lot of money, you know, and probably, yeah, 6 figures, of course, at least. So 6 figures, no, 9 figures, sorry. And yeah, so when you procure a launcher, of course, the performance is something you have to consider. There are rockets, you know, which are much more powerful than the others. You also have some condition you have to share in a very, I would say, subtle way when it comes to multiple launches with Ariane 5. So you have to share certain issues with that. So that means Ariane 5 in the future, you know, Ariane 6. Ariane, to keep their cost, you know, the lowest, they had adopted from the start this idea of double or triple launch, you know. So that means that, yeah, you can launch at least, you know, 2 big satellites on board, you know, a single rocket. But you have to consider that your satellite, if your satellite is on time, maybe the satellite that is supposed to be launched with your satellite is maybe delayed, is late. And in such case, you have to wait because all the satellites are not necessarily interchangeable. Okay, so this is part of the risk, you know, I was mentioning to you that you also have to consider for your project. And the cost, of course, or the price you will pay, you know, is not only the only factor you have to consider. Okay, same thing. The cheapest is not necessarily the best, you know, for that. And after that, when your spacecraft is in orbit, okay, you have to think about the operation, and especially for how long will be the operation. What is your ground station? How many people? And so on and so forth. So that's something which is not completely obvious. And also enter into the game something which is extremely practical. So we're getting with these words, you know, put in order. It looks like sort of a phrase, okay? And you start to do a little bit of finance, you know, when you talk about insurance. So what kind of insurance? What's your philosophy of insurance? For instance, for space insurance, including the launch. So in other words, space insurance is the insurance that starts when the rocket takes off and that ends when your satellite is positioned on its final orbit, or sometimes even longer. And for that, you have 2 kinds of philosophy. That means that if the satellite is lost during the launch, you can either ask the insurer to give you money back or to claim for the proceed of the insurance. So that means the insurance, you know, where the insurer were committed to indemnify you for the loss of your spacecraft. But the amount will have to be predetermined. And for that, as I said, you have mainly 2 philosophies. You can consider that, oh, if your satellite is a failure, you want to reimburse everybody, and you will never manufacture this spacecraft again. Okay, that's called a refund. Okay, and you said, okay, we're done. Or there's a reflight. Reflight philosophy is that, okay, I just decide that the insurance proceeds will serve to purchase another launcher, manufacture another satellite, and all the thing, you know, that goes with it. And for that, the sum insured, so the amount which is at stake, you know, in case of failure, can be very different. And of course, the consequence of that is that the premium you will pay to the insurer will be extremely different. Okay, so these are these kind of factors you have to consider. And last but not least, of course, in your budgeting, you have to consider that money, you know, is never free. Even though we are since 2008, you know, we're in a policy of almost free money, let's say. And for that, you can have a loan. And if you have a loan, you'll have to pay an interest. Okay, so this is something, you know, you still have to have in mind. So you see, in fact, making some budgeting is extremely complex. You will remark that I really focus on talking about alphabet and words, because on that chart, you don't see any numbers, even though the numbers, you know, are in the background. But you have to picture in your mind all of these factors. And when you're trained enough, you know, to do that, you will know exactly what to do with your project. We can go to the next slide. Okay, and the big phrases are the business plan. Okay, the business plan. In fact, everybody, you know, of you, I'm sure, you know, have seen a business plan. The business plan is not necessarily this this Excel spreadsheet I put upside down on the purpose, okay, because I will be back on that concept of credibility, okay. But I would emphasize on something which is the most important part of it, I think. Even in the presentation, the very takeaway you can have is that the very reason for a business plan. Everybody talks about the business plan to show to investors, okay? So when you build a business plan, you show this business plan to investors, even, you know, your friends, you know, who may have a little bit of money and would be happy to bet something on your project. But when you build a business plan like that, it's like, you know, the human nature. You're trying to please the person, you know, who will read it, okay? And you will explain in that business plan how beautiful you are, how beautiful the project is, and so on and so forth. I disagree with that. My point is that the business plan has a very purpose. The business plan is here to put numbers, so we don't put words anymore, but numbers. Of course, the business plan, okay, you have business plan when you write, you know, the forwards and so on and so forth. But let's stick, you know, to the business plan or let's boil down, you know, the business plan to numbers, you know, in your Excel spreadsheet. The business plan is an exercise you have to do with your team internally to make sure that you don't forget anything, okay? Don't forget the customs, don't forget the transport, you know, don't forget of the impact in the numbers if you lose something, okay? Don't forget about the penalty you can pay to your clients if you're late, okay? So all these components, all this part, you know, that were in the form of words, okay, must be put in a sort of a phrasing, okay, made of numbers. You have to translate the story into numbers. And then you can see if your business plan looks pretty good or not, okay? And also when I talk about credibility, of course, most of the time is the credibility of the revenues, okay? People, they try to say, oh, my business is so extraordinary that my sale, my sale in a few months, you know, will be $1 billion, for instance, you know, which is quite difficult to achieve, you know. And after that, you know, they show some exponential curves, you know, that say, oh, I'm the best. I'm Elon Musk, you know, I said, you know, like Gillian said, you know, oh, there's a lot of Elon Musk, you know, I'm Elon Musk. Everybody's Elon Musk, you know. Even though Elon Musk, you know, I'm not sure, you know, Elon Musk, you know, would write a business plan like this one. So that means that probably the trickiest part in a business plan, you know, is the revenue, the profile of the revenue. So that's why it's an insightful exercise you have to make in team and try to be extremely reasonable, and a business plan that forecasts sales over 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, okay, is less and less and less credible. A good business plan would probably describe what are your costs, you know, during maybe the first 6 months, maybe the first 12 months, okay? And after that, you can jump into sort of a quarterly business plan, okay, 3 months by 3 months like this. And after that, you stop and you see after 24 months, if you realize, what you have planned, especially for space, which is a lot of, in which, there's a lot of pitfalls. I think that if you follow roughly the same profile, I think you'll be very, very good. But mostly the revenues being the trickiest part of a business plan, what is good to do is to maintain or to keep, your business plan at the level of evaluating the cost and the risk. After that, if you go into complexity of the business plan, when you want to develop the cash flow analysis and the P&L, and of course, as a consequence, the balance sheet, of course, you will need to figure out, what kind of revenue. But again, the business plan is really an internal exercise to make sure that you don't forget anything. So that's why I wrote, again, my, relying on the financial forecast, but not at any cost. So I think it's a good, again, exercise, of humility. And after a while, when you're very used to it, you can try to forecast, when you do your first sale and so on and so forth. So we can go to the next slide. And this is my final slide. So because after the business plan, you have to write the business. So you have to write, and you have to, of course, write Shakespeare and go into finance. So what kind of where is my approach to get some resources? Do I raise fund? Do I try to have a loan? Of course, it's very difficult to have a loan. What kind of promise, I make to my investors? What do I offer to my investors? Sometimes it's your own money. So what do you expect, with your own money? You're putting your money at risk, and so on and so forth. This is a part of finance. But the final touch, of this presentation is, yeah, there's really no darkness, but ignorance. So I think, what's key is, this is from Shakespeare. Of course, you guess it was from Shakespeare. And the most important thing is that, yes, you have to go into this exercise in very much detail. Of course, it's always good to find some help from friends or from people, who are experienced. And this must be always a humble exercise, and that really focus on the detail, okay, and make sure you don't forget anything. So this is my, in very short, that presentation. Of course, for a guy like me, and everybody who knows me, guess that I'm very frustrated because I have tons of stories to tell about what we can meet in making some budgeting and finance. But I'm waiting for your comment or question, and I'm happy to answer to them.
I see, Francois. So we will just take some questions now. Actually, I see someone raise their hand. Gabriel, if you can type if you have a question, feel free to type it in the Q&A box, and then we can take a look at it. We can take a look at your question and try to answer that. But I think what Mr. Dubrul has shared today is immensely useful for any of the teams who are especially interested in participating in the young entrepreneur pitching session, which takes place next year. So if you don't already know, we have a parallel event as part of ISC, where we get teams to turn their projects into business ideas and pitch it in a kind of mini entrepreneurship competition, where you stand to win separate prizes and things like that. So everything that's been shared today is immensely useful for that, and I think it's a great way to get you guys into thinking a bit more outside just the engineering aspect of all your projects, especially for those teams who are maybe more interested, or people who are interested in pursuing other areas in other careers in the space industry besides just the engineering route or the scientific route. But yes, does anyone have any questions? Feel free to type it into the Q&A box or into chat, and then we can address anything. If you guys are having difficulties with the financial report within your own project, also feel free to voice out those questions, and we'll see how we can help. So this is also useful for it's not just for the open category students. Obviously, financing would be immensely helpful for the star category as well. If you are sending your experiments to the International Space Station, there are different things obviously that you have to take into consideration of besides just the how long your satellites will be in orbit and things like that. The cost of sending things to the ISS now, I think, has been pretty standardized. I'm not sure. There are a couple of companies that are managing the commercial side of launching non-government projects to the ISS. So I think it's been pretty standardized, and I think you can actually try to look for a couple of companies online that are doing that. Do we need to convert our expenses to our local currency? I would say for your reports, at least use USD as a standard across, just so that any of the judges, no matter where they are, will immediately know what you're talking about. But it never hurts to actually indicate what currency you are using in your report.
But if you're a company under the Singapore jurisdiction, your accountant, will convert everything into Sing dollars, okay, according to some admitted official currency rate, conversion.
Surya Prakash has actually a very good question, which is, what are some of the places that we can possibly cut corners if we are finding that we are running a bit tight with your budget?
What is it? Where are some places where we can cut corners? What kind of places? I don't really get, the question actually.
I think he's asking, like, in the case where they are working within a budget, and the budget's maybe they're running out of money. What are some of the areas? What are some of the areas they can possibly cut back on? Like, which are the parts that they can maybe save money on to maybe help with the budget?
Places, okay, places meaning, activity or, okay. Yeah, you ask there's two easy answers. Answer number one is you ask your team to work for free. Okay, of course, they will not be very, very happy and they can leave. And the second is you don't pay your suppliers. No, but it's a very interesting question. And this is something you have to think about upfront. In other words, there's a lot of instrument, and we are very close to finance, in fact, how we use resource, where to pick, and how to pick and to use resource, the best way. Depending on the track record, depending on the interest of your project, you can ask your suppliers for financing or indirect financing. So it will accept to make you some to cut let's say part of his price, and to put this amount at risk. Okay, so and it will so give you some credit. Of course, you can also ask your customer some deposit, okay? And everything for that, is in the provision you negotiate with them. And you have to say, okay, thank you for that. Because if my company fail or if I'm bankrupt, you will lose this amount of money, okay? But if my company succeed, you'll be happy to be paid, okay? Completely. So that means that everything is possible at each and every level. You just have to get in touch with your counterpart and try to discuss. And sometimes, to be very open on that and say, I'm sorry, guy, I don't have money enough. I made a very poor budgeting from start. And now I have no money anymore. So what do we do? Okay. And of course, it depends on the amount, And this is what usually, there's some bankers, they say that a guy who has $100 loan, it's an enemy, so you can crush him. But a guys who have $1 million loan at your bank, it becomes a partner. Okay, so it's totally pointless to try to hammer a guy who owes you $1 million. Okay, so it's a very subtle discussion you may have. And I'm not sure, it really answers your question, but one thing is sure is that you cannot transform your, I don't know, your $100,000 project into a $50,000 project just because you have problem to pay. So you have to discuss with all the stakeholders and find an acceptable way in spreading the risk, around you. So you're not only the only person, to have the risk, but you ask your suppliers, your employees, and your clients, to take some risk. I would insert an advice, a very modest piece of advice. Don't give your equity like this to your suppliers, your consultant, your team, or even sometimes even your client, which is a bit weird. Okay, because equity is something which is not free. Okay, because equity is like a marriage. So when you give equity to someone, you're married with this guy for a very, very, very long time. Okay, so, and there's a lot of things that can happen down the road. So my point of view is that it's a very bad advice, I would say, to swap equity against some, I don't know, big discount on a component to supply.
So I think also, yeah, basically you shouldn't be cutting corners. Ideally, a space project is expensive, it's true, but the risk of cutting corners is a lot higher if you happen to launch your project and because of some corners that you cut, it caused it to fail. So definitely don't skimp on the technical aspects of your project. And then just for reference, I think if you actually look up some of the big space missions recent years, especially the ones by like maybe either Blue Origin or SpaceX, you will find that a lot of times the budget that the initial budget they had planned for was much lower than how much they actually spent. And that is the case for a lot of space missions. And I think what Francois mentioned during his presentation, which is usually because of things like delays, things that they didn't account for, insurance, things like that. Insurance is very expensive in the space industry because of the high risk of all the projects, just for your information. So yeah, unfortunately, this is one of those industries where it's very hard to save on projects that are valued at a certain price. Yeah.
Yeah, that's correct. That's why, in fact, the cost of a project, so cutting corners is something everybody understands, but in front of the cost, you have some revenues. So you always, instead of cutting corners, try to improve your sales, try to improve your revenues. Because of course, cutting corners, as you said, there's a level, you cannot go, beyond, it's impossible. So, so the level of increasing the revenue, is almost limitless. So it's much better to try to work on the sales than on the cost cutting.
Which is why for the ISC project, at least, we tell a lot of the students to not focus on the numbers, but focus on the justification of for the numbers that they have given. Because we know that it's very hard to stick to so if we give a standard budget across, it's not going to be flexible for the kind of projects that you want to do, especially when we give you the creativity to go kind of crazy with your ideas and your projects. So we've kind of given estimated ballpark budget of sense when we were giving the guidelines, but again, we're not looking so much as the number as the justification behind your numbers.
And that's a good point, Gillian, and it just echoing to what I said before. When you build your spreadsheet with your budget, each and every line must be commented. where this number comes from. As I said, is it a rough order of magnitude price? Is it a selling price? Is it a firm fixed price? Each and every line, must be commented. Okay. And okay, when we see, hope it answers your question. I see, did you ever happen to have a supply chain problem, especially during COVID? I would take it, in a more general way, is that there's what we call, the black swan, this kind of event, which is so big that nobody could predict this event, okay? And we don't necessarily speak only about COVID. It could be an earthquake. When an earthquake, just, let's say, damage part of Taiwan, and all the chip manufacturer are facilities, are damaged. Okay, all the production of, or a lot of, there's a lot of chip makers, who are really impacted, and they cannot deliver. Okay, they cannot deliver your components. And of course, I mentioned that point in particular. So COVID is part of it, even though there's people who said, oh, COVID is not a black swan. Okay. But in your budgeting, there are events which are very hard to predict. And sometimes it's totally pointless to try to predict. Don't try to predict that, oh, an asteroid, will strike the Earth, will hit the Earth, or there will be an earthquake somewhere, I think instead of that, you have to think about, oh, if that component, is not delivered to me, what is my backup? What is my fallback plan? What is the alternate component we have to find? We have lived, recently a minor event of that sort with our spacecraft here in Singapore. There's a photodiode, which was totally unable to find on the market, just because all the supply chain in the world were totally disrupted. And for that, we had to find an alternate component. So the consequence of it is that you're wasting time. You're wasting time. And there's also a consequence is that your supplier can say, oh, but I have to look for an alternative component. It takes me time. I have to redo some engineering to make sure it fits, very well your motherboard or whatever. And the guy can ask you some money for that. So this is where, your contract, must be very well written. In other words, the guy is engaged and committed. The firm fixed price, I told you, is a very important factor. When it's a firm fixed price, if the provision of your contract are properly written, the guy cannot ask, for more money about that. Okay? But again, always remember, don't try to make your suppliers miserable. They work with you and they work for you because they can make some money. If you're too harsh with them, if you consider that they don't deserve, making money, they will simply don't work with you. And if they own a certain technology you want to obtain for your spacecraft, could be very dangerous because your project, can be at risk, at big risk. Okay. So again, you remember what I told you at the start. There's no perfect answer about that. There's a really, every factor must be weighted, before you engage, with a third party.
We have another couple more questions. What would you do with the extra money in a project? What is an improvement that is not exactly prioritized, but would be great to have if you still have a little extra budget?
You make a big party. No, it's, I would mention a very short story, which seems to be a bit extravagant, but which exists. Okay, it's probably an exception. There was this project called Iridium. I'm sure, everybody knows Iridium. And for the youngest of us, they know probably Iridium as a system, that works. But I lived, the first Iridium in 1997, which went bankrupt, after a few weeks operating. But Iridium was financed by Motorola. Motorola pumped a lot of money into the company. And because the Iridium people, they launch the constellation at a cheaper cost. Okay, there were some extra money, as you mentioned. They decided to split this extra money, between the team. Okay, so it could be appreciated, in a with a different mood, because you have your shareholders. The shareholders, they don't give money for you to spend the money, in costs which are not related to the project directly. So more seriously, a project, is not limited to cost on a, I would say, limited scope of work. Because when you launch a project and it's a commercial project, the development of your project continues. So that means that the cost which, or the money, you said, will serve for other things. And as you mentioned in your comment, it can serve to improve the second generation of a spacecraft, for instance. Okay. And so that means that, yes, you always have to consider that there would be some contingencies in your project. So that means that, yes, you have to consider sort of an extra cost into it. For space, you can say 5 to 10% of the total budget. But, in certain business, this margin is way much higher. As the architect, when they built a building or a very complex infrastructure, the margin, can be 20, 30%, sometimes. Okay. So this is how you have to consider this extra money.
What is a good budget that we can consider? I don't really think that there's a good budget just across the board. I think that entirely depends on what's the project that you are working towards. For the ISC, at least, we gave kind of a ballpark figure that everyone could work towards. I don't remember what the number was exactly that we put in the guidelines, but that's kind of the figure that we offered. But like I said earlier, it's not so much about the number, it's more about the justification behind your numbers. But yeah, and I know there are a lot of teams that are working on different kinds of missions. I know some of you are working on a small satellite constellation. Some of you are planning to just send one large satellite up to orbit. So different satellite missions, different budgets. Yeah, it's entirely based on your projects, I think.
I would add something. I think, it's this question is a little bit vague, but it's an excellent question. Because a good budget is a budget in front of which you can find the money. Okay, because you can have a project that costs, so you make your budgeting and you say, I need $100,000. Okay, so your budget, becomes a good budget when there's a guy in front of you who said, okay, you have this $100,000. Because so that guy, okay, that would be an investor or a friend who could lend you the money, could say, it's a good job and this project can work and I accept to take risk, for this project. I like it. Okay. So good budget is a budget, for which you find the money.
Someone asked, approximately what should be the maximum total expense of a cost-effective large-scale space project?
Wow. I think the most extreme is probably the James Webb Telescope. Everybody's waiting for. I think it's $10 billion US. Okay, that's the most expensive project of NASA. There's no maximum. Again, you have to put it against, the money you will find to make your project real. And of course, the higher the cost, probably the weaker your profit. Okay, so it's a good exercise to try not to be too extravagant with the cost. Just imagine that, okay, you can find the money you want. You're Elon Musk, you go on the market, everybody trusts you. And so that means that, yeah, you can develop this project for 1 billion or 10 billion or even more. Okay, if you are too extravagant with your cost, if it's too costly, you will never make a single dollar as a profit. And after that, you lose your credibility. So again, you always have to think ex ante, okay? So that really means that what can happen if I don't fulfill my promise to the people? Because again, making your budgeting, trying to establish the bottom line with a cost or this line, which is the total cost, you have to, of course, to make a promise to the person who brings you the money to make your project. Okay. And of course, the more expensive it is, the hardest, to make some profit. But, I would say a good entrepreneur, always feel that, it's really in your guts. When you start a project, you're very, very careful, with your spending, you're very, very scarce. Yeah.
We have a last question for the night from Yong. Do you have any suggestions about optimizing the process of decreasing costs throughout the project's alphabet?
It's a good point. It's a very interesting question. It's a bit theoretical, but do I have an example? It all depends on what is the dynamic of your project. I'm not sure I answer this very good point, by the way. But I would say sometimes you can decide, you go for a component, okay? And the component cost, let's say, is 100, okay? And so you said, I will procure this component and things like that. And you remark, along the way that, there's the equivalent, component next door, which is sold 80. So what do? Do you terminate the contract with the first supplier and go to the $80 component? Maybe. But again, it always boils down to the risk, okay? If you do something, there are some consequences, okay? So the first supplier, maybe you'll have to pay a sort of a penalty because the guy say, you terminate my contract in the middle of my work, but I already, did some work. And even yourself, sometimes, you already pay a deposit and the guy doesn't want to give your deposit back. So you lose your deposit. So at the end of the day, the real cost of doing this is more than 80, probably 100, maybe 110, 120. So it's very, very tricky, again, depending on the subject. Sometimes, yes, for sure, it's the difference is so obvious. And swinging from one solution to another is very easy. So yes, you don't have to hesitate. What I mean by my comment is that optimizing is not a theoretical exercise you can do, as I mentioned, ex ante. This is something you do every day, with your project. As a good entrepreneur, you always have, a sight on your spending, okay? And from that, you can always try to, let's say, to screw the bolt, tighter, to make sure that you're still within the budget you have decided from start. I don't know if it answers your question, but I think it's a good question too. Okay.
Yeah, that was the last question we have for the evening. If there's no other questions, I think. We don't have any other questions. So hopefully you guys managed to learn a little bit more through this session. Thank you again, Francois, for taking the time out of your schedule to do this on a Friday evening. for hanging out with us on a Friday evening.
I'm in space. I'm in space. You know, you see the moon behind me. Yeah, so that's fine. But thank you, everybody, and good luck for your project.
Yes, so actually Francois will be looking through some of your projects. So he will be evaluating your financial reports when it comes down to it. But yeah, so thank you all for joining us this evening. I wish you all the best when it comes to writing your projects. So like I said, this is our last ISC webinar for the year. The next time we meet up will probably be at the year-end party on the 17th of December, which is the time for all of you to kind of relax. You shouldn't really be working on your projects too much anymore, although I know a lot of you will still be rushing the midnight oil and doing all your last minute work. But hopefully at that point in time, most of your stress would be gone already. But yeah, I wish all of you the best. If at any point you guys still have questions, I am still available via email and will be there to help you guys for the rest of the challenge all the way into your submission deadline. Yeah, so thank you all for joining us, and I wish you all a good evening and a good weekend. Thank you, Francois.
Thank you. Good luck, everybody.